Welcome, everyone. This is John Windhausen, Executive Director of the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, or Shelby Coalition. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar called Broadband Policy After the Election, What to Expect from Congress and the Next Administration. So, as we all know, former President Trump was reelected as president. The Republicans retained a slim majority in the House, and the Republicans flipped the Senate and will have a 53 to 47 voting advantage there. So this webinar is intended to begin to discuss what we can expect from this Republican sweep on telecom and broadband policy. And as I said, this will just be the beginning of the conversation, as the election was just a week ago and the new administration is still in the process of naming people to some of the key positions that will determine our broadband and internet policy. But there are some things that we can be sure of and others that we can say are likely, and other things that we will keep an eye out for and look for in the coming days. Given the high stakes for anchor institutions and the high visibility of these issues and the big tech companies in particular, this is sure to be a very robust conversation. Before we get started, just a reminder of some of the logistics of this webinar. First, we want to thank the companies that are supporting this webinar, Zayo, T-Mobile, Ready, and Cisco, and we very much appreciate their financial support. I will also remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. Audience members are muted, but we encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to send us your questions. And as always, you can follow along. You can follow us on social media at Shelby Coalition or hashtag Shelby Webinars. Before we get started, I'd also like to add just one word about Shelby membership. And we depend on our membership dues to support our operations. So if you are not a member and you support our work, please consider being a full member of Shelby. More information is available at our website at shelby.org/membership. Okay, it's time to turn our attention to our outstanding panel of speakers. Andy Schwartzman is with us. He is Senior Counsel at the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. Andy has been the Dean of Public Interest Advocates for several decades and is very familiar with presidential transitions. In addition, we are very pleased that Ansley Erdel is joining us as well. Ansley is the Managing Partner at Salt Point Strategies, one of the nation's premier advocacy firms in DC, and her firm represents several Shelby members. Ansley formerly worked for Republican Congressman Nathan Deal from Georgia. And we're also joined by Kristen Engebretson, Shelby's COO, Chief Operating Officer, who will help to manage the questions in the Q&A box. Unlike past webinars, we will not be asking our panelists to make a presentation, and we do not have in-depth slides to share. We will just use a Q&A format for the entire hour, and we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box as well. So with that, let's get started. So as I said at the beginning, this was a Republican sweep of the presidency, the Senate, and the House. So starting with you, Andy, and then we'll go to Ansley. What do you think this means in general at a high level for anchor institutions, broadband policy going forward? Andy?
Well, in general, there's always great uncertainty at these kinds of transitions. And frequently it takes a while for things to calm down. While the directionality, I think, is unmistakable, there are a number of uncertainty factors. Senator Thune was elected majority leader today, which is important in many respects. Among other things, for some of the issues that Shelby members care about, he's not in the same place as Senator Cruz is, who's likely to be the Senate Commerce Committee chair and has the power, if he wishes to use it, to rein in and keep things from going to the floor and so forth. And so that relationship, remains to be seen and creates a lot of uncertainty. The appointment levels at the FCC, which we'll talk about, also probably pretty clear how it's going to happen, but there's uncertainty there. And the close margins in the House make things fractious and some of the issues that we care about here, where there's a lot of Republican support for various programs that affect rural communities and so forth. Getting a consensus may not be easy. On the other hand, Trump's ability he has much greater control than he had 8 years ago. So that all remains to be seen. I guess the one other interesting factor, and there's a certainty to it, but the degree of impact remains to be seen. And that can be summarized in 4 letters, MUSK.
All right, we'll come back to that. Thanks for that teaser. Ansley, I'd love to get your take on where you think at a big picture, how this Republican Congress and Republican White House are going to influence broadband policy going forward.
Well, I would say I don't think there were a lot of people, at least in DC, who were predicting a Republican sweep. So everybody is still recalibrating over what this all means. But I completely agree with Andy that there's still a lot evolving. With Senator Thune being elected Senate Majority Leader today, former Commerce Chairman, these issues are very important to him. So we do have a Majority Leader now who has been more thoughtful on these issues than maybe, they're more priority issues, and being from a rural state can be helpful when you're thinking about funding broadband initiatives. He has that unique perspective that will be helpful. But generally speaking, I think Republicans tend to favor smaller government, less subsidies, and have historically, I know we're going to get more into specific policies, so we can talk about those as they come. But I think those sort of stereotypical things are relevant for when you're thinking about broadband policy and issues that are important to Shelby. I will just add that the biggest advocate in the Senate for the Affordable Connectivity Program was Vice President-elect Vance. And so, there are some soft spots within this administration and this Congress. And so I think that there are windows of opportunity to be able to, effectively advocate for things that are important to Shelby.
Well, that's a good reminder about the Vice President-elect's position on ACP. We'll come back to that later, but I tried to find what the president himself has said, President-elect Trump. I did find an interview that he gave on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he talked about the BEAD program and exaggerated it a bit and said we're spending $1 trillion to get cables all over the country up to upstate areas where we have 2 farms, and they're spending millions of dollars to have a cable, while Elon Musk can do it for nothing. So what do you take from that? Is that, do you think?
I think it's foreshadowing where this is going to go. There's going to be scrutiny over the spending for sure. There's going to be oversight over programs, but a lot of the money in the BEAD program has already been obligated. So I think that what we're going to see happen is the money will be made eligible for satellite service like what Starlink is offering. That is undoubtedly, in my mind, will be something that happens. As Andy said, Elon is kind of the it factor and is dominating in our space in terms of how this administration thinks about policy. And so where they can create opportunity for Starlink, they're going to do that. And I think it starts with BEAD.
Gotcha. Andy, go ahead.
First of all, I would observe that the president's depiction of this and his perception is that of somebody who was born and raised in Queens and then moved to Manhattan. Clearly does not understand that the areas that don't have service are largely rural, and that the commitment to universal service, the commitment to get everybody connected, which has broad economic impacts, including for people born in Queens and raised in Queens and living in Manhattan, getting to that as close to 100% as we can, has broad economic impacts. He doesn't seem to understand that's what this has largely been about. On the other hand, Elon Musk wants to do it, and how it gets done is going to be different. But it's just reflective of the fact that other people are going to make decisions and whisper in his ear. And he's no reasonable likelihood that President Trump is really going to understand this issue. This is not like Bill Clinton, who was inside of every policy decision, or people like Biden, who had years of legislative experience. This is going to be done at a very high level, and the degree to which the last person who talked to the president may get him to turn around, that's all just creates a lot of uncertainty. We'll have to see.
Well, those are good points. Let me turn it back to Ansley because she raised a good point that the majority leader race was won by John Thune from South Dakota, and he used to be chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. Obviously, South Dakota is a very rural state, receives quite a bit of E-rate money. It also has a lot of local telephone companies, rural telephone companies. So, Ansley, just turning it back to you, do you see that Senator Thune would have a strong interest in any broadband policy legislation that comes down the pike, or is he going to delegate that to the Commerce Committee chairman?
I think he will generally delegate that to Senator Cruz. I would say spectrum might be one area that he continues to be highly engaged in. I think he's been involved in trying to come up with proactive, USF reform, contribution reform, thinking about those things. I think that falls to the wayside for him. I don't think that there's going to be as much activity around USF while there's litigation pending. It gives them time to say, we're going to let the courts play out and not touch this, because it is such a difficult issue to navigate. And I think that has been shown time and time again. So my expectation is that he will continue to, just having the understanding and knowledge that he has on these issues will be beneficial, in my opinion, because whether he's leading on them, which I expect him to not be the lead, he won't have the capacity for that. He will have thoughtful approach to how they proceed with these policies. And I think for our purposes of the choices that were there today between Cornyn, Thune, and Rick Scott, I do think that it is the best outcome we could hope for with a majority leader for our issues.
I would say that, as I characterized it before, Thune has the power to rein in Senator Cruz more than anything else, and to veto. He just can keep things from going to the floor, and can exercise that power. But if, as I suspect is quite likely, there are modifications to BEAD that reduce or entirely remove preferences for fiber, which would give Starlink access to greater amounts. And if RDOF, and Elon Musk has appealed his being thrown out of RDOF, if that magically gets turned around, there will be a lot of support from that direction for continuing these programs, albeit in very modified and deregulatory ways. So it's, again, very harder than usual, I think, to predict some of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well,
I would just say, just on the relationship between Cruz and Thune, I would expect Thune to be pretty deferential.
Yeah, sure. Just at the edge,
unless he needs to do something. But
right, at the edge that he can say no, and that, I think that will shape things somewhat.
And Ansley, you both mentioned that Senator Ted Cruz is likely to be the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. Shelby has had some interactions with Senator Cruz, and unfortunately, we had to oppose one of his legislative efforts last year to amend the E-rate program to require schools to implement social media policies as a condition of obtaining E-rate funding. And we were able to convince the Senate Commerce Committee to put that legislation aside. But it's also possible that with Senator Cruz coming to be chair, that issue could come back again. So we need to be prepared for that. What else, Ansley, can you imagine that Senator Cruz might be interested in pursuing? Is he going to, do you think, continue to defer to this congressional working group on universal service reform? I know he's had a spectrum bill that he was working on as well. Give us your thoughts about what Senator Cruz's priorities are.
I do think that the spectrum legislation is a priority for sure. That's something that he's worked on with Thune, so could be a nice opening salvo to show a good working relationship between the two of them. So I expect that there will be some focus on spectrum. There's also the added benefit that they have a positive score. And so given that reconciliation will be coming up very quickly, I anticipate that there will be efforts to try to include spectrum legislation as part of a reconciliation deal in some form. Obviously, Cruz and Cantwell have been very far apart on their approaches. And so to the extent that Democrats are able to impact that, I think they will try. But, you know, I think there is some deal to be had on getting spectrum as part of a reconciliation deal. So that would take out a lot of the beginning of the year. And then, you know, I think that Cruz will continue to have some scrutiny of broadband programs. He's certainly on USF. I really don't think that's where he's going to spend his time right now. They don't have a resolution. So it's hard to imagine that they're going to start down that rabbit hole right out of the gate, just because what they've been working on has not been very fruitful in terms of a working group, and they haven't really come to a consensus. There's also, you know, privacy legislation nobody's been able to get that through. I think they have ideas on that, that they, you know, may or may not decide to pursue, given that's also been very difficult to navigate. And then I would say, you know, to your point on the USF eligibility, I would expect that they could continue to try for some type of online safety for children, not necessarily related to E-rate, not tying that, but COSA or COPPA or some of these things that they've been trying to get done. I really don't see a path for them in the lame duck. And so that's another thing that they may pick up on in the new Congress.
I was going to agree with Ansley, or make the point Janet just made, that Marsha Blackburn is not going away on the online safety. And although it was killed in the House this time with modifications, I would think that has a lot of appeal and has real prospects. I'd also be curious if Ansley agrees with this, because this is, you know, I don't know the Republican side anywhere near as well as you do, Ansley. In the spectrum area, historically, while there is actually a considerable division in approach between Senators Cantwell and Senator Cruz, in spectrum, it's to some degree bipartisan, and there is a common enemy, and the common enemy is the Defense Department. And Thune has been on the commerce side of that fight, and I wonder if that's going to influence in some of the, I mean, historically, this is to some degree bipartisan and much more based on jurisdiction and committees and those interests. So I'm curious if you think that will come into play, Ansley.
I think that script has flipped a little bit. I mean, it may also be because of the work that we do in working very hard to preserve unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi and shared spectrum arrangements. But I think that, you know, historically, you're right, it's been a jurisdictional fight. There are a number of members who have SASC and the Armed Services Committee and Commerce who sit on both. And so there's a shared loyalty to those committees, and that's created real problems for them to be able to come to a consensus. I think the DoD historically, even not always literally have a veto, but have been able to overcome a lot of these policies where they're being forced to move and clear and auction spectrum where they operate. And I don't know that will change. We'll see how much President Trump respects the DoD people that he puts into place and where their perspective is. But, you know, right now, I think the big thing that the carriers have going for them is that they want to purchase spectrum, and that is a pay for. And so I think there are very few members who are actually focused on spectrum policy, but they see spectrum as a pay for, and they forget about the policy and the benefits of Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies and are quick to just take the money. So there are going to continue to be policy fights about how you do a pipeline, and is it going to be exclusive auction, exclusive licenses that are auctioned, or are there other ways to think about a more comprehensive spectrum policy?
I'm going to do a very short nerdy digression because it does affect this. For odd reasons that make sense to the people who do this, the way budget scoring is done, auctions and exclusive licenses and even shared licenses are valued much more than true shared spectrum, which well, it's a policy preference. It does create an obstacle, and that we're just kind of stuck with that.
Yeah, thanks
So
for
we
that
can get dynamic
clarification, Andy.
scoring.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Ansley, one clarification. When you talk about the reconciliation bill as a vehicle for spectrum reform, are you talking about during the lame duck session?
No, I'm talking about in next year, in the beginning of the year, probably Q1 will be reconciliation. And I think they will definitely be looking at every pay for that they can find. And there are not a lot of them.
And when you say pay for, you're talking about the spectrum auction revenues that could be then
Correct.
used to pay for different programs. And there are a lot of ideas about how to spend that money. And that's one of the reasons why the spectrum bill hasn't passed yet, is that there's no consensus on how that money should be spent, or whether it should all go to the Treasury and reduce the deficit. Well, let me pause here.
I'm not predicting this, quite the contrary, but I just need to drop the footnote that you never know what happens in the United States Senate in the last moments of a session, lame duck or otherwise. Amazing, unexpected things happen. And I'm not predicting that, but people should realize that sometimes all of a sudden the rabbit comes out of the hat.
Oh, I remember when I was on Capitol Hill, an experience just like that, Andy, when we included some language in the budget bill just before adjournment regarding Rupert Murdoch and his TV station licenses and newspaper cross ownership, if I recall. That was a long time ago, but you're absolutely right. Let me take a pause here for a moment and turn things over to Kristen. Do we have some questions in the Q&A box, Kristen?
Yes, we do. So we have a couple that want to circle back to the idea of Starlink. So the first one is from Tom Esselman. It's asking about national security. Does that become a factor when you're evaluating the long-term comparison between Starlink or satellite and fiber?
Wow, that cuts both ways. And I can't really come up with a strong prediction on it.
What are the two? How does it cut both ways?
Well, domestically, fiber is a lot more secure and a lot easier to protect from foreign surveillance than satellite. On the other hand, internationally, the benefits of LEOs to military and national security are very substantial. That's really not my department, but I think that's an excellent but complicated question.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add that I think in terms of the making Starlink eligible, I do not think that will play much of a factor. I don't think that there's going to be a thorough assessment of that. I think they're just going to do it.
Mm. And that may answer the second question Kristen has. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, exactly. From Bob Boger, he asked about if Starlink would be eligible for RDOF.
That's an appeal pending before the FCC. And to jump ahead to some of the stuff we're going to talk about, notwithstanding various priors, Brendan Carr very early on figured out that he should be whatever Elon Musk thinks he thinks. So I think there's a strong possibility that Elon Musk will be back in the RDOF game.
Gotcha. Before we finish reviewing the makeup of the committees, we haven't spent enough time talking about the House side. Ansley, do you have some comments about who is likely to chair the House Energy and Commerce Committee? I know Bob Latta from Ohio has said that he's interested in that job, but Kathy McMorris-Rogers, the former chair, did not run for re-election, so she is leaving that post at the end of the year. Who else do you think are going to be candidates to be
So there
chair
are
of the
two.
House?
There are two candidates. Brett Guthrie from Kentucky is a candidate, and Bob Latta, as you mentioned. There was the prospect of a dark horse candidate with NRCC Chair Richard Hudson, but he has decided to stay at the NRCC, which has cleared the field and meant this is going to be a two-person race. The expectation is the vote will happen after the Thanksgiving break. And so I think it's that first week in December is when that vote is expected to take place. And then, it will also impact who chairs the telecommunications subcommittee as well. So those things are to be determined. I think both are, reasonable and have been engaged on telecommunications policy. Latta currently is the subcommittee chair. So I think that race is going to be, one to watch, and we will know in a couple weeks who will have the gavel.
Is that a little earlier than usual? I thought the committee chair positions weren't voted on until January, when the new Congress convenes.
So it may be a little earlier. Sometimes we don't know. A lot of times when there is a other speaker vote and those types of things, they will hold back on who's getting assigned to seats on the committee in order to leverage that. But I think that in terms of chairman, I think the expectation is that those are going to be chosen. There have been lessons learned about waiting and not having committees up and running. And so my expectation is that they'll be able to hit the ground running no matter who is chosen.
Interesting. And do you think the loser of the full committee race is a likely candidate to chair the telecom subcommittee?
Well, Congressman Latta currently does. And so that would be a continuation. I believe Congressman Guthrie would probably not be he would probably be at a different subcommittee or in a different spot. I would not expect him to be the telecom chair.
I would add only this, that not unlike the situation in the House in this current term, where as chair Frank Pallone put his fingers into the telecom issues a good bit because he cares. Similarly, Bob Latta, this is one of his areas of concentration. He knows and cares about this stuff, and whoever the subcommittee chair is, I think Latta will want to have some influence as to that, which I might say is somewhat positive, because on the spectrum side, he's very comfortable with unlicensed spectrum.
Gotcha. And on the Democratic side, is it safe to assume that Mr. Pallone and Ms. Matsui will continue on the Democratic ranking minority member on the full committee, and then Ms. Matsui on the telecom subcommittee?
I defer to Andy, but yes, I think that is the expectation for sure.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, that would be good news because we have good relationships with them. Well, what does that mean, though, if it's Latta or Guthrie that wins the Commerce Committee chair? Andy, you just mentioned that Latta has a respect for unlicensed and shared spectrum, which is useful. What else would be on the agenda, do you think?
I would just mention that Latta was the co-chair of the Wi-Fi caucus, has been for a number of years. Guthrie was the co-lead of the Spectrum Working Group with Matsui, so has been, a very bipartisan member. I think both of them are going to be easy to work with, but they are going to be pushing an agenda that is largely driven by President Trump and Elon is going to have a big impact. So I think there'll be, with the trifecta in play, I think there'll be a lot of coordination with what the FCC is trying to do, with what the president is trying to do. They will be working to reform some of the programs that we've talked about. And so, we'll see. I think the same applies for COSA, privacy, those issues that have left undone. Many of the much of the reason for the shortcomings has been they just couldn't reach a bipartisan agreement, and now there won't be the pressure to do that. Obviously, in the House, the margins are very thin, but there are opportunities for them to get some crossover Dems to support efforts if they, are able to limit like a private right of action and get some consensus on that. You might see some of these things move forward.
Very good. Very good. Let me bring Kristen back in. I know we've got some questions popping up in the Q&A box. Kristen, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the questions was just about the timeline for appointments and changes in leadership, but at the FCC.
Well, I mean, Brendan Carr is, certainly the darling right now of the FCC. So I would anticipate that he will take over as chair. I expect that Jessica Rosenworcel, the current chair, will resign, inauguration day or somewhere around there. And then there'll be a 2-2 commission. And so they will need to nominate and confirm a third Republican commissioner in order to have a full commission. And, there's still pure speculation over who might be in that seat.
I would observe, first of all, it is tradition, but not law, that the FCC chair steps down from the commission. On inauguration day or the next day, the president can and will appoint a sitting member to be chair or acting chair. But it's conceivable that Commissioner Rosenworcel may stay on, and sometimes they do stay on for a few weeks if there's some sort of pension or leave goal that they want to hit. They take unpaid leave for a month or so. But effectively, she probably will leave. I would point out again, historically, everything can be different here, but historically, the Democrats have been slow to get an FCC majority up and running, and the Republicans have managed to do that very quickly. They understand how to get those confirmations through in the Senate to gain that majority. So I would expect that to happen relatively quickly.
Okay.
Gotcha. Kristen, who's next?
Got a question from Ted Hearn asking if any FCC's rules will be at risk if a GOP Congress uses the Congressional Review Act.
Well, it's kind of hard to tell. Again, I'll defer to Ansley on this exactly, but the reach of the Congressional Review Act is a function of how long the number of legislative days that are involved that trigger it. If there is a shorter lame duck, there's more room on the other end next term to get CRA resolutions through and converse. So it's hard to predict exactly how far back it can go, but there are unquestionably a number of items that the FCC adopted starting in May or June or July of this year that will be on the chopping block. And I would expect a number of those things to be subjected to Congressional Review Act scrutiny.
I always feel like the CRA is a bigger threat than a promise, but we'll see.
I'll just add my 2 cents in here too. I did some research into the Congressional Review Act and how it operates. And as Andy said, you count backwards from the date that Congress adjourns on January 3rd. And so you count backwards the number of the days that Congress was in session. So if they have a long lame duck session, which is possible because Congress just reconvened yesterday, and the budget deal expires on December 20th. So they might be in town for as long as 5 weeks here now. And then they had about 30 days when they were legislature was in effect in September. So that might put the start of the push the start of the Congressional Review Act to any decisions after like September 1st. Now, the E-rate hotspot lending decision came out in July, August. So if September 1st is the starting point for Congressional Review Act, the Congressional Review Act would not be able to be used to reverse the FCC's hotspot lending program. But if it goes back to August 1st, then perhaps it would be vulnerable to being overturned by the Congressional Review Act. But those are the kinds of things that we don't know until after Congress adjourns. And so it's still an open question.
County legislative days, it's like dog years. It doesn't bear any reality to the real calendar, the Gregorian calendar or whatever it is we use. But I would observe there is one aspect of the Congressional Review Act that is significant, that when there's a Congressional Review Act resolution, it not only immediately abrogates whatever the agency action was, it also prohibits the agency from adopting roughly similar rules in the future. And that has a long tail potentially, or there's no judicial construction of what that means. But those things that are not vetoed by the Congressional Review Act, a number of those things are going to be quickly reversed by the FCC, but a future FCC could reinstate them, whereas if it's done by the CRA, they can't be, or may not be.
Gotcha. Let's turn our attention to the Universal Service Fund. We already alluded to the fact that Congress has been working on I can't say that the right way. There has been a congressional working group on universal service reform that's been in operation for over a year. And Ansley, I think you said earlier that they have not reached consensus on a bill, but they have put together different drafts that Shelby was invited to review an outline at one stage, but that never turned into actual legislative language. So now with this new makeup on Capitol Hill, do you think that a working group on universal service reform is going to continue? That was a bipartisan, bicameral effort. But it all depends, I think, on what Senator Cruz and Senator Thune would like to do moving forward. What do you think, Ansley?
I think that that is going to continue to stall, in particular with pending litigation, as I mentioned earlier. I think that they're able to say, oh, we're going to wait and see how that plays out. I think contribution reform is going to be really difficult and continue to be really difficult. It always has been. So my expectation is that they're going to focus on more red meat issues, to be honest, rather than working on USF reform. That said, I would say Cruz is not a big fan of USF, as most people probably know. So I think if it does come up, there are certainly going to be efforts to shrink the program, not grow it.
I certainly would contemplate some shrinking, maybe a considerable amount of shrinking. But it is, again, this is where you have these multiple factors come into play. Senator Cruz, and there is support for moving to an annual appropriations process, which I don't think Senator Thune and a number of other Republican senators will be particularly happy about. But also at the FCC, within its existing powers, and in his, we haven't mentioned Project 2025 and Brendan Carr yet, there is a lot of interest in getting both telecom providers and edge providers to participate in USF contributions. And that may, as long as X/Twitter is not involved in that, if that's carved out, those are real things that'll be on the table that may be attractive to many Republicans and some Democrats.
So So John, we do
know-
have a USF question in the chat box. Randy Fleshman asked about the new administration is planning to place international tariffs on most, if not all, goods. Has there been any discussion on increasing the yearly available funding due to equipment prices, parts made overseas potentially rising? And part two of that question, if tax cuts are planned, how will that affect USF fees? Is the administration going to see those fees as a tax?
There were a couple questions in there.
Yes, there were.
So I, certainly think that on the tariff question, Congress and the administration is generally reactive and not proactive. And so I would not anticipate them doing anything about increased cost until they actually play out. And even then, I would argue that would be unlikely, that they will really address the increased cost or blame it on the tariffs, even though that would likely, certainly cause prices to go up. So, Andy, I don't know if you have thoughts on the tariff.
No, to me, it's a big black box at this point.
And then on the tax question, I mean, I don't think that USF is really, the people who are managing the policy on USF understand the difference between the tax and what USF really is. But certainly think that it will be part of Cruz's talking points that this is a tax that needs to be eliminated for sure. I mean, he's going to continue to oppose the USF. I don't expect there to be a lot of friendly fodder there on USF.
Without getting into the legal definitions and some of the stuff that they'll be fighting about in the Supreme Court about USF, I would observe, because I think it's relevant to this question, that the USF fees that are collected, I'll call them fees because that's what I think they're legally properly characterized as, never goes into the federal budget. It goes to USAC and goes back out to the carriers, and it doesn't affect budget or budget score. Well, in a tiny little way it does, but it largely immaterial. So extent that they're focusing on budget and deficits and so forth, USF is sort of on a parallel but different track.
Well, also just one other point about the Universal Service Fund discussion. I think there is a natural inclination by legislators to say if it's tied up in the courts, well, let's wait for the Supreme Court to issue their ruling before deciding how Congress should try to address the Supreme Court decision. So there is a bit of a natural inclination to wait. On the other hand, there's also a train of thought that would say, oh my gosh, the Supreme Court decision could be horrendous for universal service. So maybe we should try to ask Congress to move more quickly to safeguard and protect the Universal Service Fund, including E-rate and rural healthcare, and try to insulate it against any potentially bad Supreme Court decision.
I'm going to, again, try to avoid getting too deep into the weeds here. First of all, the Supreme Court conference for this coming Friday, 2 days from now, is supposed to take up the USF cases. It's possible they'll defer or delay it or something, but we should have a pretty clear idea in all likelihood next week, if, as is quite likely, the Supreme Court is going to do that. If it doesn't, then this all starts very quickly. But again, hyper-technically, I will avoid getting into the weeds. The actual, what's actually at issue before the Supreme Court is the contribution factor for the third quarter of 2022, and that's all. So while a decision upholding the Fifth Circuit would mean going forward, that's going to have to change. It requires some future action by somebody in order to put that into place.
John, I just put a link in the chat for everyone to read your new blog, giving the update about all of the USF litigation that's happening.
Well, thank you very much for doing that, Kristen. I appreciate that. But that does provide some background on all three pending cases that are will have a big impact on policy. I'd also like to ask the panelists the question that Jordan raised in the chat, because that is such an interesting question. Now, just yesterday, or last night, I believe, the president declared that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to head up this new Department of Government Efficiency. Now, this is a brand new development, brand new department. I guess it's going to be affiliated with OMB, but it's not going to be a traditional government service.
It's
going to be
more of
sort of an outside group.
outside of the government that is intended to advise on how they can be more efficient. So
Go ahead.
so I was just going to say, my expectation is that they will make a lot of noise. And we will see how much they will actually be able to effectuate change. I definitely think that they're going to do things to shrink a lot of these agencies. But I think it's still TBD on exactly what they're envisioning.
Two observations. As is many cases, this may well depend on staff because neither Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk understands the first thing about how the federal government actually functions. They just know they want to cut time and delays and permitting things and so forth. But the other thing is this is where the current posture of the FCC becomes highly relevant. While the Supreme Court may soon fix or change this for the immediate future, the FCC is an independent agency, an independent bipartisan agency, and there is only so much that the executive branch, even if they're named Elon Musk, can do in that regard directly.
Well, they can certainly make recommendations and get press attention. I think that sounds like that's the main purpose but it also could benefit those individuals. I could easily see this department focusing on vehicle transmissions and energy supplies and medical care that would benefit Musk and Ramaswamy in their own personal lives.
I would think that NHTSA and NASA are going to be particularly affected in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's going to be an interesting thread to follow, a brand new issue. Let me ask a couple of different questions here. We haven't really talked about Carr at the FCC, who we all said earlier is likely to be the next chair of the FCC. What do you think Brendan Carr's major initiatives are going to be? Do you think he's going to try to affect the E-rate program and rural healthcare program in particular?
Let me start with a qualification, which I keep on making these historical qualifications. I think less here than in some other times. Sometimes, and this applied much more to filling the FCC vacancy than the chairmanship. Sometimes somebody that those of us in the DC policy world and our kind of little circles know for sure the candidates and so forth. Sometimes people turn up that nobody in this world has ever heard of. Reed Hunt, Gloria Tristani, to pick a commissioner in the past. There have been others who kind of came out of the blue. Adam Kandub, who all of a sudden became acting head of NTIA. So you never know. Well, but as I said, that I think all that said, Brendan Carr, who has campaigned much more overtly than is typically the case, and campaigned in the right places very shrewdly on Fox News, where Trump has seen him. I think he is the odds-on favorite. And as I've already explained, so I won't repeat, depends how quickly he gets a third member to start moving things. But he will slow down. He will start the process of reining in some things, and he will be ready and locked, loaded, and ready as soon as he gets a third vote to start repealing and modifying various FCC policies that will be on the chopping block. It will happen very quickly once they get the third vote.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say you mentioned the Project 2025 earlier, and his chapter, he talked about Section 230. He talked about big tech contributing to USF. he talked about the FCC getting tougher on China. He's been, he's a big proponent of the TikTok ban and has been very hawkish on China issues. He's a big proponent of spectrum pipeline legislation. He's been a friend of the carriers for a long time. And so working to try to restore auction authority and ensure that there are spectrum bands that are specifically designated for exclusive use. And as we've been saying, he does have Elon's endorsement. And so I would expect that in turn, there will be efforts to try to move faster on satellite launch approvals and some of the issues that are impacting satellite right now.
One long shot thing to keep in mind, because it could affect a lot of some Shelby members anyway, is AT&T has come up with an unexpected suggestion to revise the 3 gigahertz band spectrum that where CBRS is, in a way that would create a contiguous band of spectrum to AT&T's liking, but would require CBRS in its entirety to migrate to a different part of the band, which would involve a lot of costs, a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of hardware expense. I think it's shooting for the moon, but it's within the realm of possibility now. So at least keep an eye on that one.
Interesting, Andy. Thanks for that comments from both of you. Another follow-on question on spectrum. What does this mean for the national spectrum strategy that NTIA developed over the last year? Any thoughts, or is that too early to say?
I think that this administration will not uphold the spectrum strategy. I think they will probably give more authority to Brendan over these issues than NTIA anyway, but my expectation is that the spectrum strategy is almost moot.
Yeah. To the extent that this again boils down to a intra-departmental jurisdictional battle where DoD has historically been able to at least slow things down or maintain some control, I think that one thing to watch out for is whether if the new proposed defense secretary comes on board, he's never heard of spectrum. This is so far outside his realm. So does that mean he will be ineffective, or he'll turn it over to the career people at DoD who know exactly what they're doing? And so that creates some additional uncertainty on that one.
Gotcha. Let's bring Kristen back in. Kristen, do we have any more questions from the Q&A box?
No, we had one that was about Project 2025, but I think that you mostly covered it. The last piece of the question is, are we likely to see congressional action on Project 2025's recommendation repealing Section 230?
I'm sorry, can you say that question again?
The last piece of the question is, are we likely to see congressional action on repealing Section 230?
It's a good question. I think my expectation right now is that the right is in a better place than they have been. I'm not sure that they're going to want to repeal that right this minute, but we have seen President Trump already talking about ensuring that there's no labels for disinformation or misinformation and that type of rhetoric. So we'll see. I think, the X factor is a real factor.
Also, this is an area where the First Amendment jurisprudence is evolving relatively quickly, and is going to make it increasingly more difficult for new legislative approaches that rein in platforms. So there's a real tension there between kind of the laissez-faire First Amendment approach that's evolved in the courts, including the Supreme Court, versus some of the legislative proposals we're seeing. And that too is going to have to play out.
Gotcha. Well, I want to shift to a couple of sort of miscellaneous questions. First with Ansley, what about rip and replace funding? I'm still befuddled as to why that Congress hasn't provided that funding for the companies to rip out and replace their Chinese equipment. Why hasn't that happened yet? And do you think it will happen in the next Congress?
It is surprising given that there has been almost unanimous bipartisan support behind the idea of it, but the pay for has been the issue, not wanting to appropriate more money to the program without having something to pay for it. So it's been tied up, honestly, in the spectrum debate quite a bit and other issues. The latest that I've heard is that there could be something in an end of year package to pay for it. One of the things that was holding it hostage was there was a push to use AWS 3 to pay for it, and Cantwell
AWS 3 Spectrum to auction that off, right?
Yeah, sorry. And there was a push to also include paying for ACP, and that's where some of the hangup was, is that they couldn't agree to pay for both. And so there's just been a long fight over the actual funding. But my understanding is it's definitely in talks for end of year package. And it would be great if they could get that paid for and take care of those carriers.
Let me interject a breaking news thing here from 10 minutes ago. We are looking at least proposed Attorney General Matt Gaetz. That makes the entire role of the Justice Department and litigation posture much less certain than it was 20 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm. I saw that note. It's hard to know how to react to that. That is really shocking news.
I think that one thing to remember is that he requires a Senate confirmation.
Right, for sure. This will be even as a member of Congress, this will be an interesting confirmation.
It sure will. Well, we're running up against the end of this hour, and we do have time for one last question. Kristen, is there a last question that's come in?
Yeah, so Michael Flood is asking about tribal. Lots has been done in the past in regard to tribal. How could a new administration in general, or the FCC in particular, view tribal issues in terms of sovereignty, equity, etc.?
I would think this is an area where Senator Thune will have a lot of interest in and a good bit to say.
Yeah, my impression is that this is an area where the tribes have supported what the FCC has done on E-rate reform, and that's not likely to be overturned by Congress, that they're likely to be supportive.
I think they have a lot of friends in the right places, as Andy said. And I think while it's been significant dollars for the tribes, it's not significant dollars in the grand scheme of things. And so eliminating or, taking something from them doesn't save enough money for it to be them to be motivated to do it.
And it also impacts at the margins a few states where the Republicans have been on the ascendancy and may not want to disturb that.
Yep, very good points. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time for this webinar, but this has been enormously informative. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Ansley. You've been great. Really appreciate your perspectives, and we're going to need to stay in touch on a lot of these issues as they play out. So I do want to close by thanking again our sponsors for this webinar series from Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, and Cisco. We appreciate that support. And also for all of our attendees and listeners, if you've enjoyed these webinars, please consider becoming a Shelby member. As I mentioned earlier, there are several threats to the Universal Service Fund and several needs for Shelby to be engaged. We had a very active call with our members yesterday, plotting our congressional USF strategy, and we welcome you to join in those discussions by becoming a Shelby member. We are gathering the resources now to make sure the policymakers hear from us, and we encourage you to join us in that effort. Or if you are already a Shelby member, please recommend your colleagues to join as well. So thank you for attending. We look forward to hearing from you going forward. Goodbye for now.